finally, we will hear from Dr. Kenneth Marshall.
Good morning. Survivors, Mayor Walsh, friends, all of those of us who are here to memorialize the people we lost, but also to celebrate the things that came out of this, as the chief was saying. And I brought with me one prop. There's no way to do a PowerPoint here or whatever. But my son, who's sitting over here, always gets me ingenious gifts. And knowing my passion for this because of my personal history, he still has not told me how he got it, but I have a copy here of the 1942 November 30 edition, Monday morning, of the New York Times. And on the left-hand side is the entire story from top to bottom of this tragedy. And putting it totally in historical perspective on the right-hand side, and I hope to share this with you at the reception, is the story of World War II, Churchill, and the theater in Europe. So I think I'll just pass it around amongst our people here. So the thing is that is the historical perspective, and the pithy remark at the bottom of Mr. Mara's plaque over there in the sidewalk, that this is a phoenix out of ashes. We are really the phoenix, and the medical story certainly is part of that. We are indebted to the authors that came afterwards and have told the story, and particularly also to our more current journalists. Dante Ramos, on this exact day a year ago, wrote an editorial which said tragedy and not quite forgotten. Hopefully, with this event, he can rewrite it and say tragedy and remembered. Professor Fox, who's here with us today, also had written in the Globe 3 years ago a similar story, and actually Dante Ramos wrote another editorial this last August, keeping this flame alive. And we're indebted to the major authors. 3 of the 4 of them are here, or represented here. John Esposito, Stephanie Chereau. John is up from New York. Stephanie Chereau is at Bunker Hill and talks a lot in the local area. And we have the Benzaquin family. The original book written was in 1959 by Paul Benzaquin, who became a major public radio personality, and his widow is here with us today, and I believe his son is as well. This is indeed a phoenix out of ashes. We're delighted to have the survivors here. One other survivor, John Heyman, could not be with us as he was not feeling well, but he was pulled out by the Boston Fire Department through a window. As well as all the things that the chief just talked about, the other side of the coin is the enormous progress that was made in medicine. And that's what I am humble enough to stand here and tell you about. Just the names of the medical professors and people involved and the medical personnel are a staggering number of people. And we have a couple here that I'll mention today are represented. Now you ask, what is my connection with this? My mother was off the boat from Ireland and went to the City Hospital School of Nursing, stayed working there, and she was on duty actually that night on the surgical service at the City Hospital, and took care of many people, including Clifford Johnson, perhaps the poster boy for the fire with his tragic ending, and also perhaps even Dr. Jerry Slate's grandfather. Jerry Slate is here, a former colleague of mine from the Mount Auburn Hospital. His grandmother perished, but his grandfather was injured, and I believe my mother may have even been his nurse. I want to tell you that I share the responsibility here of reporting all these medical things with my medical colleagues here, and we're honored to have here today Dr. Palmer Joe Bessie, who is standing over right under that lamppost. Dr. Bessie is the president of the American Burn Association. By total chance, that society moves around the country to different major cities, and this year in March it will be here in Boston, and Dr. Bessie came up for a site visit and visited this site himself in September, and is very pleased to be here with you to have this celebration. Also here representing the medical community is my good friend Dr. Constantian down from Nashua, Mark has been president of the Northeast Society and the New England Societies of Plastic Surgery, is nationally and internationally known, and shares a particular interest in one of the aspects of the medical progress that was made, which I'll mention later, and it's great to have Mark here with me. Also, we have Matt Donlan, who's the chief of the Shriners Burns Institute, who's standing back there, and has been a friend to several of the patients and people. And finally, we have some of my colleagues, and forgive me if I miss some, but Pat Marasco is sitting right in front of Dr. Bessie. Pat is a plastic surgeon up in the North Shore, and his mother was a nurse at the Mass General Hospital and took care of the burn patients. She is sitting with him. Mrs. Marasco there, I think. Now, there are really four basic medical advances that came out of this fire. They are absolutely, to my perspective, monumental. And I think you will agree at least with one of them, because it's something everybody knows something about. But there was, this basically was a watershed change in burn care. Burn care in the 1930s and before was done by doing rapid excision of burns and basically using dyes and so on to try to prevent the rest of the fluid loss. We have here today a representative of the change, and that's Sarah Cannon Holden, who's right over here to my left. Her dad and Dr. Cope at the Mass General instituted a concept of early burn fluid resuscitation with a demi-delayed debridement and then grafting. So enormous changes came in the treatment of burns. We still use those things today. And this particular episode in history is directly responsible for it. Number two, at the City Hospital, Sam Levinson was the chief. He was the fellow that designed a mask that was used in World War II. And he was the one that pushed the concept of early intervention in pulmonary injuries. Pulmonary injuries are what probably did in 80% of the people that were lost in this fire. And he recommended early intubation and early pulmonary support. And that changed the whole modality of how that was treated. The thing that everybody will agree was a watershed thing in history is related to the advent of penicillin. Penicillin was discovered in a bedpan, as you probably all know, in 1929 in the UK by Fleming, for which he was knighted by the Queen at the time, and our King at the time. He basically turned it over to the studies at Oxford, where Florey did further studies on it, and it was feared because it was thought it would kill patients as well as bacteria. It was brought across the Atlantic in secrecy to keep it from the Axis powers because it was thought to be something that was going to be revolutionary in caring for injuries. And our federal government, in a moment of wisdom, farmed it out to the Merck labs in Rahway, New Jersey, and they were producing it for the troops in 1942. However, 2 days after the fire, a call went to the Merck labs, and it was brought up by guarded convoys of state police from New Jersey, and it was used for the first time in the civilian population for this fire. So we can attribute the onset of the use of penicillin to this particular episode. Finally, many of you who do know the geography of the city of Boston know there's a very monolithic-looking building somewhere between City Hall and Boston Garden. It's called the Lindemann Center. The Lindemann Center is now dedicated to the treatment of addictions of all kinds. Well, Eric Lindemann was the psychiatrist at MGH and elsewhere who wrote all the papers about this fire and the grief responses. And in association with that, a psychiatrist who had come here from Austria named Alexander Adler wrote the first paper that can be identified as the onset of a particular, or knowledge of a particular disease process from which so many of us still have after effects. Her paper was dedicated to the concept of understanding neuropsychiatric disorder, and what she was describing was PTSD. So I'm a Vietnam vet. We always blame the Vietnam War for the onset of that disease process, but I think we can attribute at least the knowledge of it to this particular episode. So there are really four major things that came out of this, And this indeed is the phoenix out of ashes that Tony Mayer was describing with his 3 pithy words at the bottom of the plaque that is down the street here. And we're really honored to have the Mayer family sitting directly across from me. Now, my other connection to this is, and I know Mark particularly and Pat Marasco will appreciate that, this, you know, a phoenix refers to rebirth. And now I got particularly interested in this field really primarily because of a great burn patient of my own at the city hospital when I was there as a house officer. And by the way, all my professors had been house officers at the time of the fire. So this is sort of historically got me interested. Then I had my own personal experience. But the word plastic surgery, everybody thinks we put plastic into people or we spend our whole day doing facelifts. Plastikos in Greek means to remold, a rebirth, if you will. And so that's the other connection I have to this, is that this really, to me, is a bit of a phoenix. And I know Mark particularly would appreciate that. And finally, I'd like to thank the officials of the city for really encouraging this to happen. The Public Improvement Commission that approved this with the blessing of Mayor Menino. I'd like the encouragement, actually, of Mayor Flynn, who I talked to several times, and finally Marty Walsh, who came here and stood here and saw really what the chief has just referred to as hallowed ground. It's wonderful to have the officials understand how important this is to all of you and to us.
Statistics that are mind-jarring. First of all, this fire was the second biggest fire mortality-wise in the history of the United States after a Chicago fire in 1903. It's the 5th biggest mortality of major disasters. That includes Pearl Harbor, 9/11, the Titanic. So this is a major event that happened, and it did happen in a very rapid period of time. Yes, the impact of this was that this fire perhaps started either with an electrical problem or a match and raced through the club no more than 22 minutes. Many people think as short as 7. There are historians that feel it was an explosion, and many of the people died in that very first period of time. The Boston City Hospital admitted 300 in an hour and 15 minutes, and the Mass General 115 in the same period of time. At the end of 3 days, there were only 132 left. It led to massive changes in building code regulations, fire safety, sprinkler systems, auxiliary power for exit signs, and in terms of medicine, 4 huge changes. Number 1, burn care changed forever. Pulmonary care changed forever. It was the first in the world in the civilian population use of penicillin. And it was the first enunciation of post-traumatic stress disorder. I used to be an actor when I was in school.
Go back to that.
That was a long time ago.
You can look right here.
Yes,
you
sir.
can go ahead and state and spell your name.
Yeah, I'm Dr. Ken Marshall, and I'm originally a Bostonian by birth.